speaker is going to be Frank Vitovich from Bodify. And I'll tell you two things about Frank. So Frank is a huge Philadelphia Eagles fan. So you may see...
You didn't have to tell him that. That's fine. Not this year.
Good point. He's also a super knowledgeable guy and a great presenter. So I hope you enjoyed his presentation. Faceted navigation. Almost everyone is doing it wrong. Frank?
Yes. Thank you. All righty. Awesome. Cool. All right. By the way, Megan, you didn't tell me that this X was here yesterday when I was on stage all day, so I was just... It's my fault. No. Okay, I'll try to stay within the box without staying completely still the whole time. All right, cool. All right, we're going to talk about faceted navigation. Fair warning, there's probably less Python in my presentation and a lot more Will Ferrell than you guys have been seeing up to this point. So we'll try to keep it a little bit lighthearted, have some fun, and take everybody into our coffee break. You guys already met me yesterday, so we don't have to go through this. One thing I will say, though, is that at Bodify, we're also hiring. So if there's anybody who loves technical SEO and getting really into the weeds of data, we have a couple openings on our team. So hit me up, or anybody on the live stream, just shoot us a message. All right, we're going to talk about faceted navigation because at Bodify, we work with a lot of really large enterprise websites and clients. E-commerce type sites are kind of one of the sites we work with the most, and almost every e-commerce prospect or client that we're talking to has said to us lately, we're trying to figure out our faceted navigation. Are we doing it right? Are there too many? Are we blocking? Are we blocking too many? Are we letting Google crawl too many of them as well? So as it kept coming up, we thought, well, let's take a look at this. So then we took a look across a lot of the clients that we are currently working with, and kind of just have some examples of how people are handling it. What are some of the pitfalls, of ways that you can handle facets throughout a website? One thing, nobody should be surprised that faceted navigation is an interesting and challenging topic. This is actually from 2014 from the Google Webmaster blog, basically saying, guys, facets are tough for us. They can cause a lot of problems around duplicate content and other issues that are related with creating potentially millions to billions of pages. And why that's a problem is because, as we've actually, I think already heard this morning, Google can't crawl everything. We did a study last year where we found that on average, just over a half of a website's pages get crawled within a given month. And that was across a large set of websites, varying sizes and verticals. So because we're talking about faceted navigation, which really is more so on large websites, I wanted to break that down and take a look and how does that change as a website gets bigger? So we looked at it and said, hey, about half of the URLs on a website get crawled. But when you get to sites, I got a little blurry there, but when you get to sites that are, right here, that are over 1 million URLs, only about a third of their pages get crawled within a given month. So it just tells you that there's a lot out there that the search engines are never getting to. Facets, in a lot of cases, are one of the culprits behind that. One of the reasons why, and they're warning here from I forget his name in Jurassic Park, but the long tail of search has been something that people have kind of obsessed about for years. The algorithm is really moving away from needing to obsess over long tail keywords, but there's still a lot of people who are scared about removing some of the facets and making them not crawlable because they think they might lose their long tail keywords, and that is what leads us to situations like this one. So this was a website that we crawled. It was a fairly large e-commerce site. They sold about 200,000, it was actually maybe a little bit less than 200,000 products, so a decent size catalog. We crawled 10 million of their URLs. At the time that we finished that 10 million crawl, there was over 500 million URLs that were known to us that we would have been able to keep crawling. So now imagine if we crawled those 490 million URLs that were still there in our queue, how many more that there would have been. Website was essentially an infinite loop of URLs, and it was because there was almost no facet handling going on at all in this on this website, and they were trying to determine where should we start to make that cutoff. What I thought was interesting as I started talking to some of the different people in our professional services team who interact with our clients on a daily basis, for some examples, This one stood out to me because normally you think of facets and it's mainly e-commerce sites. You think of your pricing and your colors and all those sort of things that can cause these loops. This was actually an example from a content site. So a content site had moved over to a new platform that had a form of faceted navigation. There was 1,000 articles on the site. The first time we crawled it with the out-of-box solution for this content platform, we found 490,000 different combinations of article archives on it. So it's not just e-commerce sites that this is a challenge for. It's really any site that is large in nature. So in terms of the SEO implications, most of the folks here in the room probably know some of this already. Of what are the common challenges and what do we see again across the sites that we work with when it comes to facets? There's duplicate content issues, crawl budget issues. I would say is probably one of the biggest that that we encounter. We have some examples of that, and then just also a lot of dilution of internal page rank and potential lost external link equity as well. So the title of this was Almost Everybody is Doing It Wrong, and it was a little bit of a trick, and the reason that we say almost everybody is doing it wrong is because across everybody that we talk to and we look at, there is almost no 100% clear right way to do faceted navigation. There's so much that kind of goes into all of that you have to consider from a business perspective and a usability perspective that makes facet handling almost impossible. Or almost impossible to do, say, right or wrong. And then the other aspect of that is there are so many platforms and CMS systems that aren't necessarily SEO friendly out of the box when it comes to facets. We just showed an example of how you can move to a new system and all of a sudden you have a huge duplicate content problem that you didn't have before because that system wasn't built for facets or built to handle faceted navigation well. So what are some considerations? Now, the fact that we just crawled a lot of URLs in some of these websites isn't necessarily a bad thing. They might be driving traffic, they might be providing value to your users, and that's something that everybody has to kind of figure out. So how do you start to assess, am I creating a problem with my faceted nav? Here's an example of it's a different website this time, but crawled 20 million URLs. 19 million of those 20 million were faceted URLs. So that's a pretty big number. So just looking at that, you could probably say it's probably a problem. It should be giving us some issues, but let's dive in and see if we can actually pinpoint. So here's a chart that's actually tracking. And for those in the back, it might be hard to see on the screens, but the bars across here are based on how many facets the URLs have and what percentage of those pages actually received a visit in the last 30 days. So even when there were no facets applied, only a quarter of those pages actually got traffic. As you got to 1 facet, 2 facets, and on the fourth column there, 3 facets, those pages were not generating any traffic at all. So, okay, so we probably, have some pages out there, they're not driving traffic, but is it a real problem for our SEO? What we take a look at here is now comparing how much traffic all of those pages are getting. Again, the left there is the number of facets applied to the URL. And the left-hand side, that is crawls by Google. The right-hand side is actual traffic from Google. And if we look, this site was getting almost 1 million crawls a month from Google. Just to those URLs with 3 facets that were providing almost no traffic whatsoever. So it was a huge waste of potential crawl budget for that website. And you could see once we had 1 facet, actually getting a lot of traffic. So they were able to take a look and see, well, what is kind of the cutoff point for us? How many facets should we open up to Google? And again, that's something that will be very different based on your own specific site. So when you start to try to figure out, okay, well now where do I go from here? I see all of this crawl being wasted. Sometimes the immediate result is we're just gonna block it all right now, which isn't necessarily the most elegant of solutions. And so what I always try to do is try to break things down and make them very simple, mainly because the really technical stuff, maybe I don't understand, but I try to break things down, make it simple and easy to understand. So there's really 2 questions that you need to ask yourself as you're looking at how you should handle the facets on your own website. First being, is there actual search demand for these pages that we're creating? Are there users out there looking for these? If yes, then that's something that we want to consider. The other is, do I actually have inventory to be creating these pages? It's great if people are searching for them, but if you don't have the products or you don't have the content or whatever type of listing you're creating, then you're just going to end up creating a bunch of duplicate content for yourself. So I created this little flow chart, and actually hats off, or I should say props to Aleda, because I actually got the inspiration for this from one of her Crawling Mondays videos that she did on faceted navigation, and a diagram that she created. But so I wanted to just note that based on our talk at the end of the day yesterday about citing sources, and then recreating them on your own. But so I just made a little flow chart to say, is there sufficient search demand for this? If no, we probably want to block the crawl. Now, those still might be providing usable or usability benefits to your end users, but you're not getting anything from search from them. So those would be good candidates to just block off. If yes, then take a look and say, do I have enough inventory for these? If you do, let's index those pages. If you don't, let's no index those pages for now, but we can kind of keep those on the back burner. Maybe you bring them in at a later time. So to do this, obviously, keyword research is essential. This is not a presentation on keyword research. I think I'm already about halfway through my time. So all I'll say is 2 sources that are really good for this when you're trying to figure out, are you getting traffic to these faceted pages, are GSC data, because you can actually see the queries that are coming in, and you could see, are people getting to my site using color, size, price, things like that are kind of common within facets. And then paid search data. I know this is an SEO conference, but if you are working on a website that's large enough to have facets and you have millions of URLs, there is probably another team in your building that is doing the paid search, or an agency that is doing your paid search that's spending a lot of money and getting a ton of great information that you could be leveraging to inform these SEO strategies. Once you have that, again, this is just an example of something that you could do to determine what should we be doing with our facets. Take your biggest categories that you have, map out every single possible facet, and then figure out which ones have real demand, which ones have some demand, and then which have none at all. So that was the little color coding here. I used running shoes because we are in Boston and the Boston Marathon, and I couldn't use any Eagles references this year because we're terrible. So we will just keep moving on. But essentially, do that with all of your product categories, and you do that visually first. Then go to your developers and say, this is what ideally we need to get to. You tell me, how can we get to a result that looks like this? The next question that we had was, how many products, or do we have enough inventory? Again, that's going to be something very different for every website. For one of our clients, we created this chart here where what it's doing is it's mapping what percentage of their URLs here are active based on how many products are on that page. So they can get an idea of where is the breaking point for us. Is there a point at which we have so few products that they never actually get traffic? And you could see here, I keep missing the button, as we go from 1 product all the way up to 300, the percentage, that green bar of active URLs, gets higher and higher. Again, it'll be different from every website, but it's a great way to figure out what is our threshold. Should we no index everything under 5 products, under 10 products? Again, it'll be different based on how many products you sell. Time check, good. All right, so common facet handling methods and potential pitfalls. We see people implement faceted nav strategies very differently across our entire customer base. So I wanted to go through a few of those that we see and just kind of give some tips of things that you could potentially improve on. Mention that we have Will Ferrell, or that I had to have Will Ferrell. Last year I was able to really make the entire talk track around Talladega Nights, and I tried this year, but it's weird that there's not a Will Ferrell movie that really relates to faceted search. So wanted to get him in here though. So what are the tools that we have at our arsenal to be able to help combat this problem? Created this cheat sheet. It didn't quite translate over to PowerPoint, but taking a list of all of the different types of, again, tactics that we could deploy to handle faceted search, or to tackle faceted search. And then what are those common, potential areas, or potential SEO implications. And then just kind of heat mapped it as to how good each of those is at combating that specific problem. One thing I think is really key, and actually mention it later too, is that there is no one method to tackling faceted search. You really need to put a combination of these in place to be able to, to truly handle it. So we'll go through a couple of those and might skip through some just to get us to our coffee break on time. But one, kind of no index, no problem. I think this is one we actually see a lot where, we'll crawl a website and we'll find these millions of URLs and someone will say, well, they're no indexed, it's fine, which is true from a duplicate content standpoint. but that doesn't necessarily help their crawl budget at all. Google could still be wasting a lot of time crawling all of these pages. So what we see is that I would say usually kind of a best use case for the no indexing when you're dealing with facets are those low product archives. So again, finding that threshold for your website and then applying a no index tag when there's X or less products. One quick note on that, though, is that just recently at Google's, I keep forgetting, the Google Webmaster Conference Product Summit, which was out in the Bay Area, I think it was just last month or the month before, that they had said was they do try to remember signals on a page. So if you have a page that's been no indexed for a while, maybe it was right below that threshold that you had, and you change the index status to remove that no index, it might take them a while to come back and find that because they do try to remember that. Little tip here is if you're crawling your website regularly, you could create a sitemap that only contains URLs whose index status has changed over time and submit that to Google to hopefully kind of give it a little jolt to be able to get those crawled and indexed quicker. No following facets helps as well. We see a lot of our customers do this to things like price range or the different facets that maybe have no real search volume. Whoops. Sorry, Megan, I totally moved and then it went right in my eyes. I'm sorry. Anyway, so this is great. Again, it helps kind of guide Google's crawl through the site. It doesn't necessarily help with duplicate content though, because some of these pages, if you're only using nofollow, can still be discovered elsewhere, or other ways. Google can still get in there and kind of go out of control. Robots.txt is probably one of the most common that we see. And like I said, this is one where it's very tempting sometimes to just go, Google's crawling how many of my pages that aren't getting traffic? I'm just gonna block them, which is some value to that, but there's also some potential pitfalls. In general, with robots.txt, it's a very hard signal. It's one of the few, I would say, signals that Google really respects in almost in every case. So it's very definite as well. You could cut out a lot of your website with one wrong character in your robots.txt. So test it out beforehand. Crawl your site with the new rules that you want to implement, and make sure all of your products are still discoverable, all of the content is still discoverable, and you're not blocking things out that you didn't or that was unintended. So no Eagles references, but the Sixers are okay, so we could still include them for this year. They did beat the Celtics in game 1, not that I remember, but one thing here that Joel Embiid is telling us is, don't forget to no index your pages before you potentially block them with robots.txt. I would say this is one of the most common misconceptions or maybe not misconceptions, but one of the most common things that we see when people want to block off full sections of their site. Those pages are still indexed, and if you just block them, they're staying in the index for a while. So if there are areas you want to block off, it's really good to no index them first if you can. Now, in some cases, you might have limited dev resources, and you have to make the choice of, I can either block them, or I could wait 6 months, no index them in 6 months. Then, I could wait a couple months after that and then change my robots.txt. Because we know we all deal with resource constraints when it comes to SEO, but something to consider there. JavaScript, all right, there's 7.5 minutes left on the clock back there, so we definitely don't have time to go full detail into JavaScript, but we've been talking about it a lot this morning. We actually see some customers using some really elegant implementations of JavaScript to be able to block off certain facets from being crawled. So you could intentionally make them, uncrawlable with some JavaScript. The warning here is, though, that is one, it's probably one of the most difficult implementations. It requires a lot of dev resources. It's not one line of code in your robots.txt. So it's very difficult, and you could actually end up creating some usability issues, because if you implement this in a way that your URL never changes, now if a user puts a couple facets on and they want to come back, they can't just save that URL and come back. They can't share it. They can't use their back button. So just things like that are something to consider as well. And then the last one here that we have in terms of pitfalls is canonicals. This is another one that I think sometimes we think, slap a canonical on it and call it a day and we're good. But really the original intent of the canonical tag is duplicate or almost near duplicate content, not similar content. So if you are canonicling back to pages that are maybe kind of similar, and going back to maybe like the first page or showing all of the products on a page where there's 6 facets applied, something that can happen is Google could still crawl that. It's not a hard signal, so that could still be eating into crawl budget. As Google tells us here, this is from John Mueller's Reddit AMA last April, the cleaner we make our signals, the more likely Google is to follow them. So the last section here that we have is where to start, and some actual real examples, because we went through some theoreticals, but I always like to show some things of customers that we actually saw action on this and see some results. If you are in that scenario where you have hundreds of millions, billions of URLs, and you don't have nearly that many products, cleaning up from faceted navigation can be a mess, as Marty Higgins here from the campaign tells us. And side note, if you have not watched this movie in a long time, it's really relevant these days, and it's kind of funny how real world it became when it was intended as a joke. But great movie as a side note. So where do we start? Really, we see most of our clients go one of two routes. If you don't have a huge faceted navigation problem, and you're just trying to test, we see people do kind of what I call the slow and steady. Let's let one facet be crawled, or let's remove one facet, let's measure and see what happens. Or sometimes you just go the full on, tear it down and let's build it back up. We actually had a panel at an event that we did about a month ago where we had some clients say, you know what, we didn't know where to start. We just took everything, we removed all facets from being crawled. We got our site down as small and lean as possible. And now since then we've been unveiling, or I should say, revealing one at a time to the search engines. So kind of both routes. Which route's best? It's SEO, so it depends. But it really does. It depends on the situation that you're in. It depends on the limitations of your CMS and how much dev resources you have. You might have all the grand plans in the world of saying, I'm going to no follow these over here. We're going to put no index tags on there. And then you go to your devs and they say, that's awesome. Next year or in 2021, we could definitely fit this in. So then you might have to go the nuclear route and just block as much as you can with robots.txt or through GSC. But here's just kind of a methodology to use as you're going through. It really kind of applies to almost anything in SEO though, but it's specific to parameter handling. Once you analyze your data and you kind of figure out what you want to do, implement your test that you have, measure every single possible thing that you can related to that test, and understand the results before you move on and start going to the next one. So understand what happened as we blocked one facet from being crawled. Did that improve our crawl budget? Did it have no impact? One thing that I should have actually had a slide on this in here, but one thing we see a lot is when you start to make the cuts and trying to bring down the size of your site, a lot of times we'll hear, well, we didn't see any change in traffic, which actually makes sense because it just means that the problem was so big we haven't cut deep enough yet. But that's something that shouldn't be surprising if you are having a faceted nav problem and you are trying to implement things. You might not see an immediate result in traffic because that's the one that I know that we always look at. So what are some other metrics that you should look at as you're doing this to gauge how successful this is? There's a lot on here, so we won't go through each one individually. But I would say the number of active pages that you have across the site is a really good one. That gives you an idea. If you see a huge drop in the number of pages that actually got traffic, it gives you an idea of how much long tail you might have lost along the way. The actual pages that were crawled, if you're trying to tackle the facets on your site without looking at your logs, you are kind of playing with fire a little bit, because what we'll typically see is that as soon as you make a change to how you're handling them or how you're trying to guide Google's crawl, you could almost see that change immediately the next day if you're looking at your log files, as opposed to waiting, say, weeks until rankings change and traffic starts to change. So if you do make a change to how you're handling facets and it really impacts how Google's crawling your site, you can see it very quickly by looking at your logs, hopefully before it impacts your traffic. So here's an example of when tackling a faceted navigation goes right. This is a client we crawled 300,000 URLs for. As we hit 300,000, they had 13 million URLs that were known. So again, huge disparity there. They went about implementing a variety of changes. So they did some parameter handling. Should have mentioned too, the reason that they had so many was because they had a new out-of-box e-commerce platform that allowed everything to be crawled and nothing was being blocked. So they set up parameter handling. They added no index to those thin archived pages. They used robots directives, all kind of in conjunction with each other. And the end result was a 95% increase in organic traffic to their website year over year. So a huge increase in traffic from actually reducing the size of their website. One more before we kind of take this, or before we wrap up. Here's another one. This was more recent, so we don't have what the increase yet in traffic was, but another site that moved over to a new platform needed to start handling their facets when they previously weren't. They actually saw a 20% increase in their crawl ratio. So the pages that they really wanted Google to be crawling, they saw an increase almost immediately. It was within a few weeks they could see that the pages that they wanted Google to be crawling were getting crawled more frequently. But one thing to note, and more work remains for them, is kind of a caution on this, is that what this chart represents here is all of these red URL, or this red circle here, are URLs that Google has crawled on this website. The blue are all of the URLs that were left after they did the cleanup. So these are all orphaned URLs now that they potentially cut off. Now there could be gold mines in there of maybe we blocked some things that were getting traffic. So you want to make sure after you do all this that you're monitoring your orphans to make sure that that nothing got lost in the wash, essentially. All right. I almost hit it at 0, but yeah, main takeaways, this is just kind of a recap of kind of everything that I had just said, but I'll just focus on the one that I have highlighted because I think it's one of the most important, is that as you're trying to do this, it is, I would say, mission critical to have your log files and to be able to understand how the changes that you're making are impacting Google's crawl of the site. And it's even mission critical to understand how much of a problem you are creating for Google to get through your site with looking at the log files. And with that, that was my last slide. I just made it as the time went up. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Frank. Guys, any questions for Frank? Hands up? No? 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 But you'll be here all day, too.
I will be here all day, yes.
Spotify's booth, so talk to Frank if you have questions.
Yes.
Thank you again, Frank.
Thank you.